The first thing you learn out here is that silence has a shape, and on some nights, that shape presses against your cabin windows like a living thing. My name's not important, not anymore. Not after what I saw out in the Moran stretch of Grand Teton National Park in February of 2021. I'm 43, with 19 years in the Park Service, and I used to believe I understood the difference between what's alive in the forest and what only pretends to be. I grew up around these mountains, hearing stories from locals who swore they'd seen figures darting across ridgelines, too tall to be elk, too quick to be people. I brushed off most of it as bar talk or old-timer superstition, the kind of folklore you pass around to keep the long Wyoming nights interesting. But the winter of 2021 changed everything. If you know Moran, you know it's where the Tetons feel ancient, older than the land around them, older than the stories we tell. Snow piles high against deadfall, the wind carves voices into the trees, and the cold is a living, breathing adversary that presses into your clothes, your bones, your thoughts. The mountains loom like a row of judges watching every move you make, and when you walk alone at dusk, you feel that judgment like pressure on the back of your neck. Back then, I worked mostly patrol, perimeter sweeps, wildlife checks, responding to odd calls from locals about strange tracks or shapes across their fields. Even before February, unease hung around the area like a thin frost. Not enough to call fear, just that low, steady doubt, quiet as a heartbeat. A few hikers reported screaming that didn't sound like any cat or coyote. A photographer swore he saw something standing near the tree line that ducked down on all fours when he pointed his headlamp toward it. But out here, fear often dresses up like imagination. We've all seen shadows become threats and tracks become monsters. I carried those things the same way any ranger does. Behind my confidence, behind the badge, behind the belief that I'd always be the one bringing safety, not seeking it. Then came the night of the thermal footage. It started with a call from a research technician up by Oxbow Bend. He'd been monitoring a remote wildlife thermal camera, one of those fixed units we check every few weeks. He said something crawled across the screen, slow, deliberate, and warm-blooded, but not shaped like any animal we track. The way he talked, voice tight and trying too hard to sound rational, told me he didn't want to be the only one who'd seen it. I drove out there through thickening snow, the kind that swallows headlights whole. Wind swept across the road in white ribbons, and the sky pressed down so low it looked like the mountains were leaning in, listening. My truck rattled over ice as I approached the station, a small metal building half buried in drifts. The technician, young guy, maybe late 20s, opened the door before I even knocked. His eyes were wide, pupils blown, breath sharp and fast like he'd been running. He kept glancing over his shoulder into the dark as if something might have followed him from the woods. He didn't bother with small talk, just led me straight to the monitor and replayed the footage. At first, all I saw was static heat contrast, snow as black, warm objects as pale. A few elk wandered near the edge of the frame. Then the technician froze the screen. There it was, a shape, low to the ground, long-limbed, dragging itself forward. Too slow for a cougar, too purposeful for a bear. The body was thin, with joints bent at angles no mammal in these mountains should possess. The head lifted once, exposing a flash of heat bright as a human face. But the mouth was wrong. Even in thermal, you could see it, wide, rounded, stretching far back into where the jawline should have been. No snout, no muzzle, nothing that fit into any category I'd ever studied. The worst part was the motion. It crawled like it remembered walking upright once, like it resented having to touch the ground. A ripple of cold rolled through my stomach, sharper than the winter air. I'd felt fear before, real fear, like when you nearly fall through thin lake ice or face down an injured moose in mating season. But this was different. This fear didn't flare. It rooted itself. The technician played the next few seconds in silence. The shape stopped as if sensing the camera, turned its head toward the lens, and held completely still. Not moving, not breathing, just watching. Then its mouth opened in a long, slow, unnatural stretch, and the footage cut out. The technician swore under his breath, rubbing the back of his neck. He started talking fast. Thermal glitch, maybe an overheating issue, could be a misread reflection. His voice stumbled over itself, tripping on explanations he didn't believe. He kept trying to rationalize it, clinging to the idea that every strange thing has a reasonable cause if you just explain it hard enough. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But denial is easy until the evidence sits right in front of you. I told him we'd head out in the morning to check the camera in person, see if an animal had damaged it. That night, though, I'd be staying at the outpost. Didn't say it out loud, but I didn't want to make that drive back to the ranger cabin alone. Not with that footage replaying in my mind, not with that crawling thing turning its head toward us like it knew we were watching. Snow hammered the roof through the night. Wind slid beneath the doorframe in cold little breaths, stirring the papers on the desk. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that slow, deliberate crawl, that flash of heat where a face should be, that impossible mouth. Around 3 a.m., I heard something outside. Not footsteps, not exactly. More like a dragging sound, a sweep of weight across snow. I sat up slowly, heart surging, every instinct sharpening into a blade. My boots were beside the bed, but I didn't reach for them. I just sat there, listening. Drag. Stop. Drag. The noise circled the building once, twice, then pressed right up against the wall behind my head. The metal creaked as if something leaned its weight against it. The technician whispered my name from across the room. He was already sitting upright, eyes locked on the window. The dragging stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying in its stillness, like the air itself was waiting. I finally stood and stepped toward the window, not sure whether to look or pray. The darkness stayed empty. My breath fogged the glass. Outside, the snow lay untouched. No prints, no marks, nothing disturbed, but I could still feel the presence, like a cold hand hovering inches from my throat. We didn't go back to sleep. At dawn, when the sky turned the faintest gray, we geared up and headed out to the thermal camera site. The wind cut hard, blowing the snow sideways, erasing our tracks moments after we made them. The forest was quiet. Too quiet, like every animal had retreated deeper into the trees. When we reached the camera pole, the technician froze in his tracks. A wide drag mark circled the base. Not footprints, just long grooves through the fresh snow. Something heavy pulled along the ground, and there, pressed against the metal, was a faint handprint. Not a paw, not a hoof, a hand. But the fingers were wrong. Too long, too thin, and splayed in a way that made my stomach twist, like something trying to remember how human hands were shaped. The technician backed away, breath shaking. I stepped closer, forcing myself to stay rational. But rationality can feel like a thin coat in a blizzard, fine until the cold seeps through every layer. I touched the metal. It was warm, as if something had been holding onto it, recently. Before I could say a word, the technician pointed to the tree line. Something moved, low, slow, deliberate, the same motion from the thermal footage. My throat closed. The crawling shape was real, and it wasn't afraid of us. The shape moved between the trees with an unnerving patience, as though it had all the time in the world and wanted us to know it. The snow muffled everything except its slow drag, a thick sweeping noise that rose and fell with each deliberate crawl. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't hiding. It wasn't hunting. It was watching. The technician whispered, asking if we should call for backup, but the words sounded thin, pointless. Backup meant more bodies, more eyes, more witnesses to something we weren't ready to understand. I raised a hand for him to stay still, though my own legs trembled beneath me. The crawling shape paused behind a fallen log nearly 30 yards away. Through the gray morning light, I saw just enough, its spine protruding upward under stretched skin, its elbow joints bending like broken branches, its long fingers curling into the snow. It lifted its head, and though the details blurred through the distance and the cold, the outline was unmistakably wrong. Too bulbous around the jaw, too hollow in the way it held itself, as though gravity didn't apply correctly to its bones. The air tightened around us. I could feel the technician's panic rising, his breath growing sharp and loud. Panic is contagious out here, like fire in dry brush. And if he bolted, if he gave that thing a reason to move faster, we wouldn't stand a chance. So I made the only decision that made sense, even though it felt like stepping off a cliff. I took one slow step forward. The creature's head snapped toward me. That tiny motion, fast, precise, like a twitch in the corner of the eye, hit me like a physical blow. Instinct screamed at me to run. Every lesson drilled into me over 19 years rose like a tide. Don't provoke, don't corner, don't challenge. But this didn't feel like provoking. It felt like acknowledging. Like if I didn't face it, if I didn't stand there and let it see me, it would find me in a darker moment. It would follow. It would wait. The technician grabbed my sleeve, his voice a broken whisper telling me not to move, not to breathe, not to do anything that made me look like prey. His grip shook so hard I felt it in the threads of my jacket. But the creature didn't advance. It didn't retreat either. It simply lowered itself again, pressing its weight into the snow with a strange, deliberate gentleness, as though testing the temperature with its palms. And then it began to crawl sideways. Not toward us, not away. Sideways, parallel to our position, keeping the exact same distance, as if it were drawing a line around us. As if we stood inside some boundary it was marking. I forced myself to stay still. Forced the technician to do the same, tightening my hand over his arm until he understood. The world narrowed to that slow, sickening glide of its limbs and the cold pressing against our backs like a warning. Eventually it slid behind a cluster of pines and vanished from sight. Only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath so long my lungs burned. The technician stepped back, gasping like he'd just surfaced from deep underwater. He wanted to run. His body screamed to flee, and I could see the fight inside him. Duty versus terror, logic versus instinct. I felt the same battle gnawing at my own spine, but something told me not to turn away. Not yet. When we reached the thermal camera, the drag marks were clearer. It hadn't just circled the pole. It had approached from the east, stopped directly in front of the lens, and lifted itself high enough to press a hand, if you could call that twisted thing a hand, onto the metal housing. The fingers had left long, streaked smears. And the palm had an indentation in the center, as though something round and heavy had been pressed into it repeatedly over time. The technician muttered that we needed to go. He didn't want to inspect further, didn't want to take samples, didn't want to stand out in the open with that thing somewhere in the trees, possibly circling back. I couldn't blame him. But I also couldn't leave, not without understanding. The forest felt different now, as though holding its breath. Every sound carried weight, a crack in the ice, a distant groan of shifting branches, the faint flutter of wings overhead. Each noise made my muscles tense, expecting the creature's long limbs to emerge from the underbrush once more. I knelt by the drag marks, studying them. They weren't smooth. They were uneven, with periods where the creature's weight seemed to bear down harder, then lift again, like something crawling that kept trying to rise but couldn't quite manage to stand. The thought chilled me. That thing on the thermal footage, the way it held its head, the way its shoulders hunched forward, maybe it wasn't meant to crawl. Maybe crawling was a compromise, a result of injury, or evolution gone wrong, or something trying to mimic a form it barely remembered. Behind me, the technician whispered my name, urgency pressing into every syllable. I stood. The forest had gone silent again. Too silent. I scanned the tree line, my pulse pounding in my ears. The snow was falling in small, steady flakes, each one soft enough to land without sound. But beneath that softness, beneath the hush of winter, something else stirred. A tension. A weight. Then I saw it. A shape, upright this time, standing between two lodgepole pines. My body locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't blink. The creature wasn't fully standing, more hunched in a way that made its arms hang too low, fingers nearly brushing the snow. Its legs bowed outward as if unused to supporting its weight. But it was tall tall enough that its head nearly reached the lower branches of the trees. We stared at each other. A cold wind cut across the clearing, but carrying with it a scent that froze me to the bone, a damp, sweet rot like decaying leaves soaked in stagnant water. My throat tightened. That scent felt familiar, in a way that triggered something deep in my memory. A story someone had told me when I was young about a creature that walked the Tetons long before people settled here. A legend whispered by older locals about something half man, half shadow, always hungry for the warmth of living things. I pushed the story away. Legends don't watch you from between trees. Legends don't leave handprints in fresh snow. The creature tilted its head. The motion was subtle, but deliberate. A question. A test. The technician stumbled backward, breaking the moment. His foot sank into a drift, and he nearly fell. The creature reacted instantly. Its back arched, fingers curling into the snow, shoulders rising like a cat preparing to pounce. Fight or flight exploded through me. I grabbed the technician's jacket and dragged him behind me, shouting for him to stay low. We backed toward the main path, each step slow, controlled, deliberate. Running would trigger it. Running would guarantee we wouldn't make it 50 feet. But the creature didn't leap, didn't chase. It lowered itself again, back to that unnatural crawl. Then it moved, circling us once more, keeping the same impossible distance as before, dragging its limbs in a rhythmic, sickening scrape that carved rings into the snow. I realized then it wasn't just circling. It was herding, driving us somewhere. The woods thickened behind us, the trees growing closer together, branches intertwining like locked fingers. My pulse hammered harder with each backward step. The technician kept whispering that the path was behind us, that we'd wandered, that we didn't know where it wanted us to go. But I did. A cold memory surfaced, one I'd buried for years. A cave up near the ridge, a place the locals warned their kids never to go, a place they said the mountain kept to itself. The creature's dragging grew louder. It wanted us in the cave. And God help us, it wasn't going to stop until we went. I knew the cave long before I ever put on the uniform. My grandfather used to warn me about it when I was a kid. He'd poke the fire with an old stick, stare into the embers like they were windows to somewhere else, and tell me that some parts of the Tetons weren't meant for men, not because they were dangerous, but because they remembered things older than us, older than language, older than fear. He'd talked about a hollow cut into the mountain just above the Moran tree line, a place hunters avoided even before the park was established, a place where animals refused to den, a place that held a smell like damp bones. I was young and laughed it off, thought he was trying to keep me close to camp. But once at 13, I'd hiked farther than I should have, and I found an opening in the rock that felt like the inside of a breath, warm air drifting out even in winter, carrying a scent that made my stomach twist. I never went back. Until that morning. The creature circled again, dragging its limbs across the snow with a steady rhythm that made the hairs on my arms rise. Its movements weren't random. It was steering us, nudging us, closing the escape routes one by one. And I swear the trees themselves seemed to bend subtly inward, like they too wanted us to continue in the direction it demanded. The technician's voice cracked as he whispered that we had to run, that we couldn't follow something like this anywhere. His words quivered with desperation, but his legs refused to move. He kept glancing behind him, expecting the path to emerge, expecting safety to materialize out of the trees. But the forest had changed. The trees, thick and narrow, formed corridors that guided us deeper. Snow-laden limbs drooped low, forcing us to duck. The air grew warmer. Not a comforting warmth, but a dense, breath-heavy heat, as though the forest was exhaling directly onto our faces. My instincts were at war. Everything I knew screamed to retreat, to move toward open space, to avoid enclosed terrain. But there was a deeper sensation beneath that, a terrible certainty that if we turned our backs, if we tried to outrun something that crawled closer to the ground than any predator should, it would rise. It would rise onto those twisted legs that looked so starved for use, and then we'd never make it out. A low groan vibrated through the trees, a sound like a boulder shifting deep underground. The technician froze, eyes locked onto me, silently begging for direction. I didn't have any left. All I had was dread. Thick, suffocating dread that pressed into my ribs. The creature crawled closer. Not enough to close the distance, but enough to feel its intention. It wanted us moving, wanted us fearful, but not fleeing. Herding, but not hunting. We stepped deeper into the tightening woods. The ground began to slope upward, the snow thinning until patches of frozen earth showed through. The air thickened with a smell I hadn't encountered in nearly 30 years. A damp, mineral rot. The exact scent that drifted from that cave when I was a kid. The same scent from the thermal creature's handprint. And beneath it, subtly braided in another odor. Animal musk mixed with something sickly sweet. Decay softened by heat. The technician covered his nose, gagging, but I kept moving. Some part of me, some tired, terrified part, accepted that there was no turning back. Not while the creature's slow drag echoed behind us like a warning. We reached a clearing. Snow had not gathered here, though the sky still flurried overhead. The earth was bare, dark, compacted, disturbed, as though something had swept the snow aside intentionally. The clearing was circular, 20 feet wide, ringed with tall pines leaning inward like an audience. At the far end, half hidden by rock and shadow, the cave mouth yawned open. A dark, uneven slit in the mountain. Not large, but large enough for a grown man to crouch inside, or for something broken and long-limbed to crawl in and out of without rising too high. The technician shook his head violently, his whole body trembling. He whispered that we weren't going in there, not alive, not even if something dragged us. His fear hit me in the gut, a raw, human fear that reminded me of the line between being brave and being stupid. But as I stared at that cave, a strange understanding sank into me. It wasn't taking us inside, it wanted us at the entrance. Why? I swallowed hard and turned back toward the tree line. The creature was closer now, no more than 15 yards away. Snow clung to its limbs in uneven clumps, as though even winter didn't want to touch it. Its back curved upward in a grotesque arch, its shoulder blades pressing so sharply against the skin that they looked like they might rip through. Long strands of dark hair hung from its skull, matted and frozen at the ends. And its mouth. Even from this distance, I could see the unnatural roundness of it, a shape that didn't belong on anything that crawled or walked or breathed. A mouth that looked like it was made for something other than eating, something other than speaking, something older. The creature lowered its head. The drag marks beneath its palms deepened. A low, vibrating hum rolled through the clearing, a sound felt more than heard. The technician staggered backward, clutching his ears, eyes wide as tears spilled down his cheeks. I felt it too, a pressure behind the eyes like the beginning of a migraine. The hum came again. This time the cave answered. A breath of warm, damp air pushed outward, carrying with it another whiff of that rot scent. The darkness inside shifted, as though something deeper within stirred in response. My stomach clenched. The creature wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the door. The technician muttered that we had to leave, that we needed to pretend none of this existed, report equipment malfunction, anything but this. His voice frayed with panic, and for the first time I heard something I hadn't expected. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of what we'd become if we stepped any closer, and the truth was, I felt that too. But the creature wasn't moving. It watched, waiting for us to make the next step. And behind it, behind the tree line, the forest seemed to pulse with a strange anticipation. The wind died off completely. The snow slowed. Everything held still. The mountain was listening. I forced myself to take one step toward the cave. The ground felt warm beneath my boot. The technician grabbed my arm again, harder this time. He was begging, voice cracking, breath shaky. He wasn't just afraid, he was breaking. That's when I realized the creature wasn't simply hurting us. It was testing who would go first. I looked at the technician, and for a terrible, fleeting second, I understood why the mountain took people. Not because they were weak, not because they were foolish, but because fear changes a person's shape, and the thing in the cave seemed hungry for that change. I steadied myself, releasing a long breath that crystallized instantly in the cold. I told the technician as calmly as I could manage that we weren't stepping inside the cave. We were stepping away from it, slowly, together, without turning our backs. He nodded, though his chin trembled so violently it almost looked like he was shaking his head. We began to retreat, one step, another. The creature lifted its head again, the hum returned, the cave answered, and then something moved inside. Not a shadow, not a breath, something crawling, a second shape, bigger, older, and for the first time since the footage, the creature in front of us reacted. It flinched, it recoiled. It lowered itself almost to the ground like a child expecting to be struck. The creature in the trees was afraid of the thing inside the cave, and now we were caught between them. The smaller creature, if something so distorted could ever be called small, pressed itself low to the ground, shoulders caving inward as though trying to disappear into the snow. Its long fingers curled into the earth. That unnatural mouth quivered, pulled tight as if holding back a sound. I had never imagined something like that could feel fear. And yet here it was, recoiling from the darkness within the cave like a beaten animal. The technician and I froze, breath caught in our throats. The air felt heavy, as though the mountain itself was bracing. The hum that had vibrated the clearing faded, replaced by a deeper resonance. A slow, rhythmic thud echoed from inside the cave. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape. A pulse of something dragging its weight closer to the mouth of the hollow. The creature before us trembled. It lifted its head only enough to glance toward the cave's interior, its limbs shaking visibly, its spine arching downward. A long, trembling exhale escaped its open mouth, forming a thin strand of fog that drifted toward the darkness, almost as though it was pleading. Something answered from inside. A wet inhale. Long, slow, heavy. The technician stumbled backward, but I caught his jacket before he could flee. Not out of heroism, fear kept me from turning, from showing my back to either of them. We were trapped between two things that had every right to tear us down into the dirt. I couldn't tell which one was worse. The creature inside the cave scraped forward again. A shadow shifted, wider, taller, a silhouette that filled half the cavern entrance. My pulse hammered so loudly I could barely hear the wind anymore. The technician whispered, "Oh God," but it came out broken, barely more than breath. Then a shape emerged. At first, I thought it was a man, a massive, slouched figure stepping into the light. But no man had arms that long. No man had shoulders that wide. No man had a head that brushed the rock ceiling with ease, stooping low only because the cave forced it to. The creature that crawled out was covered in matted fur the color of old moss and dust. Snow clung to the strands like bits of ash. Its arms were thick, too thick for the rest of its gaunt frame, and each step carried a slow, deliberate weight. Its breath rasped with a low rattle like stones grinding inside its chest. It wasn't fully upright, and it wasn't fully crawling. It moved in a way that made your brain twitch, a wrongness in the joints, a fluidity that belonged to predators but with a heaviness that belonged to something ancient. The smaller creature lowered itself further. The larger one stopped at the cave mouth and sniffed the air. Its nostrils flared wide and deep, drawing in our heat, our scent, our fear. The snow beneath its breath melted instantly, curling steam upward like smoke. The technician shook violently beside me, tears streaking down his face. I felt that same terror boiling in my blood, the instinct to flee overwhelming every rational thought. But another part of me, some stubborn, desperate instinct, kept me rooted. If we ran, both creatures would follow. If we froze, maybe only one would. And if we chose the wrong direction, we'd never see daylight again. The larger creature turned its head slowly toward the smaller one. A guttural noise rumbled low in its throat, deep enough to vibrate the air. The smaller creature answered with a tiny, trembling click, curling its long limbs tight against its body. Then the larger creature snapped. It lunged forward with a speed that broke the air. Snow exploded beneath its limbs as it grabbed the smaller one with a crushing grip. lifting it effortlessly and slamming it into the ground. A scream tore out of the smaller creature, a piercing, high-pitched wail that wasn't human or animal or anything else the mind could categorize. The technician tried to bolt. I held him with everything I had, dragging him back down behind a fallen log as the clearing erupted in violent, primal chaos. My heart was a wildfire, burning through restraint, through sanity. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. If we ran now, that larger creature would kill us before we took 5 steps. So we crouched, pressed against the freezing bark, watching a nightmare unfold. The smaller creature twisted in the larger one's grasp, limbs contorting, its mouth opening wide as though silent begging could convince the mountain itself to protect it. But the larger creature slammed it again, this time pinning it with an enormous fur-matted forearm. Snow hissed against its hot breath. Then, slowly, the larger creature lifted its head and stared directly at us. Instinct screamed. Rage, dread, a primal realization that we were next, or at least that killing the smaller one was the prelude. I felt myself sinking into a dark place inside my own mind, as though my consciousness were trying to crawl away from my body. My vision blurred. My limbs went numb. The clearing swayed. The technician whimpered beside me, his breath trembling so violently I feared it would draw the creature's attention more than any movement. And then something unexpected happened. The smaller creature locked eyes with me. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't begging for rescue. It was warning me. Its gaze, frantic, wide, filled with a terror deeper than its own pain, shifted from the large creature to the tree line behind us. Not toward our deaths, toward our escape. The technician didn't see it. He was too far gone into panic. But I did. And that was all it took for instinct to surge, cold and electric, cutting through fear like a blade. I hissed at him to move. Now. Quiet. Now. We slid backward, low to the ground, retreating inch by painful inch until the fallen log hid us from the clearing. Every breath threatened to give us away. Every shift of snow felt like it echoed through the valley. But the fighting kept the larger creature distracted. The screams, the thrashing, the heavy, violent impacts. We crawled. Branches scraped our jackets, snow soaked our gloves, our legs tangled in roots. The forest remained deathly silent except for the chaos behind us. Then, once we reached the thicker underbrush, I stood. I grabbed the technician by the front of his coat. I told him not to look back, and we ran. Branches whipped our faces. Snow swallowed our boots. The forest twisted, unfamiliar in every direction. Panic clawed at our throats as we stumbled blindly through the trees. Behind us, the fighting stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Then a roar shattered the air, deep, ancient, furious. It vibrated through the mountain, through our bones. The technician tripped, falling hard. I grabbed him, hauling him upright as another roar, closer, chased the air from our lungs. We kept running, hearts slamming against our ribs, fear sharpening into survival. The forest blurred until a patch of light flashed between the trees. The road. I didn't think. I pulled him toward it with every last shred of strength. We burst out of the tree line, stumbling onto the icy path, knees buckling beneath us. For one terrible moment, nothing followed. Then a shape slammed into the shadows just at the edge of the trees. Massive, hunched, furious. Too large to step out of the forest. Too bright-eyed to retreat fully back into it. The creature watched us. Shoulders rising and falling, breath fogging the air in thick, heavy clouds. Then it shifted its weight backwards, slowly sinking into the underbrush, disappearing with unnatural precision. The forest swallowed it whole. We didn't speak. Not that day, not that night, not for many days after. The technician quit the Park Service, vanished from Wyoming. I can't blame him. As for me, I stayed, because that cave, whatever crawled out of it, didn't just frighten me. It whispered something I haven't been able to forget. The forest isn't ours to protect. It's ours to survive. And some secrets the mountains keep not to hide them, but because they're still hungry. I've spent most of my adult life believing the woods would warn me before they hurt me. That was the lie I carried like a badge, the kind of confidence people expect from a ranger who claims to know the forest better than he knows himself. But the morning I found that unmarked cabin deep in Washington's Olympic forest, far beyond any mapped trail, that belief cracked like rotten bark under my boots, and something slipped into me. Something cold, something patient. My name is Mason. I'm 37 years old, and I work for the National Park Service out of the Quinault Ranger District near Lake Crescent. Locals know me well enough. Grocery clerks, gas attendants, the old fishermen who drink too early but always know the weather better than scientists. They say I'm calm, reliable, the kind of man who can walk into the timber at midnight to track a missing camper without flinching. And maybe that used to be true. Back in 2022, before the cabin, before the sounds, before the thing whose shape I still can't describe, back when I still believed fear was something you could reason with. The day it started, I was assigned to investigate an abandoned fire pit someone had reported past the old logging road on the northeast edge of the forest. May is still cold here, damp in a way that slips into your bones, but the undergrowth was waking up. Oxalis, sword ferns, the green breath of moss spreading across fallen logs. Everything felt wet, living, inhaling. I remember thinking the woods smelled almost metallic, like the air before lightning. I dismissed it. Every ranger rationalizes a few odd things each season. Instinct is useful, sure, but logic keeps you alive. Around 9 in the morning, I parked the truck at the end of the road and started hiking west toward the ridge. Fog clung low, trailing between the firs like it didn't want to lift. I kept hearing something faint, not quite birdsong, not wind, something tapping, and a rhythmic click. I tried to place it. Woodpecker? No, too slow. Branch knocking against another? Not with that precision. It came from ahead, then behind, then stopped completely. That was when the first sliver of unease slid into me, quiet as a breath on the back of my neck. About 2 miles in, I found the fire pit. Rocks arranged in a perfect circle, much neater than a casual camper would bother with. No footprints, no trash, no soot on the stones. Just cold ash and a single pine cone placed dead center on top, as if it mattered exactly where it sat. I crouched, brushing a little of the ash aside with my glove. It wasn't disturbed by animals. The cone was clean, unburned. Something about it felt deliberate, like a marker. Still, there was nothing actionable, no sign of a violation. So I photographed it, logged the coordinates, and prepared to head back. But that's when I saw the path. A narrow thread of flattened vegetation leading deeper into the trees. Not a human trail. More like something heavy had moved through, something wide enough to push ferns aside in a steady, continuous sweep. Maybe an elk, I thought, but the spacing was strange, no distinct stride pattern, just a long, uninterrupted drag. I shouldn't have followed it. That's the truth. Every bit of training says, don't chase unknown tracks alone, especially when the weather's shifting and visibility's low, but there was a pull. Some part of me insisting that whoever made that pristine fire ring might still be out here. Maybe lost, maybe hurt. I used that justification to silence the discomfort crawling inside my ribs. The farther I walked, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no squirrels, no rustling of anything but my own steps. Even the fog seemed to thicken around me instead of dispersing as the day warmed. The dragging trail led down a natural slope into a hollow ringed by ancient cedar. I stood there for a moment, realizing the ground felt softer than it should, almost spongy. A cold draft slid past me, though the air had been still the whole morning. Then I saw it, the cabin. No sign of construction roads, no mapping records, no clearing around it. Just an old single-room wooden structure folded into the forest like the trees had grown around it. The roof sagged under thick moss, and the windows were boarded from the inside. The boards weren't rotted. They were fresh, a few weeks old at most. That detail made something tighten in my chest. I radioed dispatch to check if any research groups or survey teams had permits out this far. The line crackled, then cut. I tried again. Nothing but static. I wasn't surprised. Olympic Forest has dead zones everywhere. but somehow it felt intentional this time, like whatever surrounded the cabin swallowed the signal whole. I approached slowly. Each step felt wrong, too loud in the silence. The tapping sound returned, light, quick, coming from inside the structure. I froze. My first thought was animal, maybe raccoon or deer trapped inside. But the rhythm was too controlled, too. Cautious, as if whoever or whatever was making it was listening to me as closely as I was listening to it. The door was closed, but not locked. I pushed it gently, expecting it to creak. Instead, it swung inward without a sound. The air inside was colder than the forest, carrying the smell of old pine and something else beneath it, a faint sourness like damp wool left too long in a basement. My eyes adjusted to the dim light. The interior was bare except for a cot against the back wall, a metal pail, and 3 short wooden sticks arranged in a triangular pattern on the floor. I scanned for signs of recent occupation. No lanterns, no tools, no trash, not even dust disturbed on the cot. Then the tapping came again. Not inside, behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight out the door. Nothing. No branches moving, no animals darting away. The tapping stopped the second I stepped out. I stood there, heart hitting my ribs a little too fast. A part of me whispered that I should leave. Another part, the ranger part, refused to walk away from a structure that shouldn't exist. I circled the cabin, checking the foundation. New nails, fresh saw cuts. Whoever built this was here recently, but the forest around it showed no signs of traffic, no footprints except my own. That should have made me turn around. Instead, I knelt next to the wall, noticing faint scratches etched into the wood near the base. Letters. Not well formed, more like someone had carved them with shaking hands. Just that. 1. I felt the word settle in my stomach like a stone. When I stood again, the woods felt different. Not hostile, exactly. More like they were holding their breath, watching, waiting. A pressure built in my ears, the same sensation you get before a storm rolls over the mountains. I listened. Nothing, but the absence itself felt alive. I stepped back inside the cabin, telling myself I needed more documentation. The 3 sticks on the floor bothered me. I crouched and examined them more closely. Each had been shaved at the ends as if fitted together once. I reached for one, and the second my glove touched it, a sharp crack erupted from the woods behind the cabin, like a tree splitting under force. I jerked upright, adrenaline flooding my veins. Another crack, closer, and then footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, crushing undergrowth in a slow, measured approach. I'd heard elk, black bear, even the occasional cougar. This wasn't any of them. The cadence was wrong, too bipedal, too controlled, too heavy. Each step landed with intention, as if the thing knew exactly where it was placing its weight. I stepped back, gripping my radio even though I knew it wouldn't connect here. My breath sounded too loud in the tiny room. Whatever was out there stopped moving, just beyond the tree line. I didn't see it. I didn't hear it breathe. But I felt it. An awareness pressed against me like a cold hand over my mouth. I took one step backward toward the door, and something outside matched it. Perfectly. My heel brushed the cabin floorboard, and the instant that faint creak escaped the wood, the thing outside responded as if echoing me. A single, heavy shift of weight, deliberate and slow. The air thickened until every breath felt like drawing cold sap into my lungs. I swallowed hard, forcing myself not to freeze completely. Rangers who freeze in the woods don't come home. I pushed my back against the cabin wall, trying to peer out through a narrow gap between 2 boards. My flashlight beam cut through the fog like a blade, illuminating nothing but a mass of cedar trunks and hanging lichen. But the sense of presence, God, it was suffocating. Not like being watched, more like being measured. A deep exhale drifted through the trees, not wind, something alive. A shudder crawled up my spine. My mind scrambled for rational explanations. Elk, bear, unstable old trees, but none matched the cadence I'd heard, the intentional steps, or the way the forest had gone silent around it. Silence isn't natural here. The Olympic woods are always humming with something. But around that cabin, not even the insects dared speak. I forced myself to move, slowly, quietly. I didn't want to stay in the cabin. Whatever was out there already knew I was inside. The structure suddenly felt like a trap, a tightening throat of old wood. But leaving meant stepping into the open with something that moved like a man, weighed more than one, and breathed like it didn't need air. I took a long breath and held it, steadying myself. Fear was trying to make decisions for me, whispering that nothing natural walked like that. But rangers don't run from trees or shadows, and if someone was out there intentionally building an unmarked cabin on federal land, I needed answers. I stepped to the doorway. The forest felt different, wound tight, coiled. Fog shivered between the cedar limbs as if stirred by something too large to see. I lowered my stance, eyes scanning left to right. That's when I noticed the drag trail again. Freshly disturbed earth leading away from the clearing deeper into the woods. Something had moved recently. Recently enough I should have heard it. I clicked my radio again. Static, a burst of something that sounded almost like a voice. Then nothing. The signal wasn't blocked. The cabin itself wasn't causing interference. Something in the surrounding air felt heavy, electrically charged. I stepped out. The moment my boot touched the moss, a thick knock echoed from somewhere behind the cabin wall. One knock. Hard, hollow, like someone's fist slamming wood from the outside. I spun around, flashlight sweeping. Another knock, this time from the right side. Then left. It circled the cabin. Slow, testing. My heartbeat kicked into a sprint. Something was pacing, stalking around the structure just out of sight, tracing its perimeter like it wanted to memorize every inch of it before deciding what to do with me. I didn't stay to find out how patient it could be. I backed away, step by careful step, boots whispering through the moss. The knocks followed me, mirroring my distance, moving around the walls with unnatural precision. When I was halfway into the tree line, I turned and walked. Not running. Not yet. Running triggers pursuit. I'd told that to dozens of hikers and campers throughout my career, but every instinct in me wanted to sprint, to scream, to claw my way uphill until my lungs bled. The tapping grew lighter as I left the clearing, then faded entirely. The fog thickened around me again, masking the path ahead so fully that even the neon green moss lost its color. My flashlight beam seemed weaker, swallowed by the moisture in the air. Each breath tasted metallic, like biting a coin. Then I heard a sound that nearly made me drop the light, branches splitting behind me, followed by long, dragging breaths. They were slow, cavernous, like something inhaling the entire forest at once. It moved with unbearable patience, never speeding up, never hesitating. Whatever it wasn't hunting me, it was hurting me. I kept moving, muscles tight, ears straining for direction. Every few seconds I'd hear a soft thud behind me, too measured to be an animal scrambling over roots. A two-legged cadence, one I couldn't mistake now. My mind went to the scratches carved on the cabin wall. 1. What did that mean? 1 warning? 1 survivor? 1 more? A gust of cold air rushed past me and I froze. It carried a smell, earthy, sour, like wet fur matted with old sap. My jaw clenched. I knew that scent from one incident years back, a reported ape-like scream near the western trails. We never found the source, but several trees had deep gouges at shoulder height, far too high for a bear. I'd laughed it off back then, called it an urban myth in uniform. Now, walking through fog that felt alive, I wasn't laughing. The dragging breaths came again, closer. Too close. I broke my own rule and ran. Branches whipped past me as I pushed uphill, lungs burning from the cold air. My flashlight bounced wildly, carving frantic arcs of light across the cedar trunks. The footsteps behind me sped up, not chasing, just matching pace, as if enjoying the escalation. I didn't dare look back. I only stopped when my foot hit solid ground. Hard, rocky soil that told me I'd reached the ridge. I stumbled, catching myself on a fallen log. The fog thinned slightly here, giving me a wider view of the forest below. That's when I saw it. A silhouette, tall, too tall, standing at the bottom of the slope where I'd just fled from. Shoulders broader than any man, arms hanging low, unmoving. Its outline seemed wrong, like its edges flickered with the fog, not casting shadows but absorbing them. It didn't climb toward me. It didn't move at all. It just stood there, watching. The ridge breeze cut across my face, cold enough to sting. My breath hitched. The figure was far, yet every instinct screamed that if I looked away, even for a second, it would close the distance without making a sound. I forced myself to breathe slowly through my nose, trying not to let panic rupture into full terror. My hand drifted toward the radio again. Static, then something else. A voice, thin and warped by interference. Mason. My own name. I nearly dropped the radio. No one should have been able to reach me out here. Not at this elevation, not in that pocket of interference. And the voice, it didn't sound like dispatch. It sounded too strained, too distant, like someone underwater trying to speak through a dying signal. Another burst of static. Leave. Just that. One word, drawn out, barely audible. It sounded human, terrified, pleading, and not any voice I recognized. I stepped back, gaze still locked on the silhouette below. It remained frozen in place, unnatural in its stillness. Something inside me snapped. A thread of reason stretched too thin between logic and survival. I turned and pushed down the opposite side of the ridge, feeling the slope tug me into a half slide through salal and fallen branches. My legs burned, breath hammering, but I didn't stop until the trees thinned and I saw the faintest hint of familiar terrain. The old logging road shining pale in the distance through the trees. I was almost there. Then the woods shifted. The air warmed suddenly, unnaturally. Birds began calling again far too quickly, like they'd been unmuted all at once. The forest went from predator still to abruptly alive. Every instinct told me this wasn't safety. This was an illusion, a curtain being drawn to hide what stood behind it. But I didn't slow. When I finally reached the logging road, I nearly collapsed against the truck, fumbling with the door. My hands were shaking so violently, I had trouble gripping the handle. I forced myself inside, slammed the lock down, and sat there, gasping, staring into the rearview mirror. Only fog. No figure, no movement. Just the forest, pretending again to be harmless. I drove back to the station in silence, not daring to check the mirror more than necessary. When I arrived, I filed a vague report about unauthorized structures and possible wildlife disturbance. I left out the silhouette, the knocking, the voice calling my name. Some truths don't survive paper. And yet, that night, long after I'd gone home and tried to calm myself with hot tea I barely tasted, something happened that ensured I'd never convince myself it was just stress or misinterpretation. At 3:17 a.m., I woke up to a knock on my front door. One knock. Hard. Hollow. Just like at the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I sat in the dark while the knock echoed through me like a pulse. My house was miles from the forest edge. No one should have been there. After a long silence, I forced myself to stand, walked to the living room window, and lifted the corner of the curtain. Nothing. But the porch smelled like wet fur and sap. And in the dirt outside my door, pressed deep into the soil, was a single long footprint. Too long for any man, too narrow for a bear. I don't go back to that part of the forest anymore. Not alone. Not ever. Because something there learned my name, and it's still counting. I always believed that the mountains only spoke when the wind carried their voice. But on Old Rag, in the summer of 2020, I learned that some echoes weren't echoes at all. Some of them were answers. My name doesn't matter as much as who I used to be back then, a ranger who trusted his own senses more than anything. I was 37, physically sharp, mentally steady, and proud of being assigned to Shenandoah National Park's most unpredictable peak. Old Rag has a personality, if you ask the locals. They say the granite remembers, that every footstep leaves more than a print. It leaves a trace of you. I'd laugh at that when I first started. Back then, I thought folklore was just the wilderness giving lonely people something to talk about. My work days were rhythm, lace my boots, radio check, trail check-ins, and the slow climb into the humbling quiet of the blue-gray slopes. Old Rag isn't the tallest mountain, but it might be the most temperamental. Dense woods at the base, exposed rock scrambles near the top, caves carved into the hillside that grow deeper every year as if pulled open by invisible hands. And in summer 2020, more people were showing up. Restless hikers desperate for fresh air after months at home. That meant more rescues, more oversight, more nights spent checking the rocks and ravines for those who wandered off in search of solitude but didn't understand what solitude asked in return. I'd been on the job long enough to grow comfortable with the strange things: sudden temperature drops before rain, the distant black bear huff, the rhythmic thumps of deer hooves moving unseen through mountain laurel. I learned to tell the difference between harmless sounds and sounds that meant trouble. But the one thing I'd always trusted was my own hearing. Sound never lies, not when you know the woods, until that July. It started with a call from a group of local hikers, 3 people in their 40s, healthy, experienced. They claimed they kept hearing someone calling for help from a cave off one of the illegal side trails. Not an echo, they insisted. A real voice. A man yelling the same phrase over and over. Is anybody there? The hikers didn't stay long. They said the voice stopped answering their shouts, then started repeating whatever they said back at them, word for word, but slightly delayed and deeper. And off somehow like it wasn't shaped by lungs. I should have written it off as nerves. But their faces... I've seen people who've spotted a bear, survived a fall, even ones who've gotten lost overnight. Their fear was different. It wasn't about danger. It was about being acknowledged by something that shouldn't have noticed them. Still, protocol is protocol, so I hiked up that same afternoon. The sun was bright, the air thick, the cicadas shrieking loud enough to make you feel like you were walking through static. I followed the illegal trail until I reached the cave, one I knew about, but that wasn't officially mapped. It sits low against the hillside, narrow at the entrance but wide enough inside for 2 people to crouch. Locals call it the mouth. You can imagine why. Gnarled roots hang from the edges like teeth ready to close around you. I called out the way a ranger does. This is Shenandoah National Park. If you can hear me, call back. Silence. No voice. No echo. Just my breath and the slow, sticky beat of sweat sliding down my spine. I figured the hikers misheard something. Maybe a fox's scream. They can sound like a person crying if you catch it right. I was set to turn around when I felt it, the air shifting, like the cave inhaled. I froze. A low, almost imperceptible vibration hummed from inside, like a deep note played from far away. It wasn't threatening at first, just wrong. A sound with no source, a sound that didn't belong to a living creature. It reminded me of standing inside a dam tunnel once, hearing the water churn behind thick walls, powerful, inevitable, old. I stepped closer, crouched, shining my flashlight into the black. Granite walls glistened with moisture. The floor dipped just a few feet in before curving left into darkness. Nothing unusual, and then I slipped, not physically, mentally, just half a second. My vision stuttered like reality blinked, or I blinked without meaning to, and in that fraction of a moment the hum stopped. Then I heard it. A single tap, like knuckles hitting stone. Once. Twice. 3 times. Slow. Deliberate. Waiting. That sound didn't belong here. It wasn't shifting rock or dripping water or animal movement. It was intentional. My radio crackled sharply, snapping me back to myself. A burst of static, loud and jagged. I lifted it, answered, but no one spoke. The line was dead. Still crouching, I leaned closer to the cave. Is anyone inside? My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Nothing. Only when I stood to leave did I hear it again. Faint, almost teasing, carried on the stale breath of the cave. Is anyone inside? My own words, repeated back to me. Same pattern, same cadence, but lower, rougher, like it was being dragged across gravel. My bones went cold. I stepped back so fast I nearly stumbled. The forest around me felt different now, thicker, quieter, as if listening. I forced myself to speak deliberately. I'm a ranger, I said. If you need help, step out. Otherwise, I'm leaving. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then something stepped toward me from inside the dark. Not a person, not an animal, just sound. Footsteps, but not on stone, not the clean, crisp sound of a boot. They were softer, heavier, like something placing its weight carefully, as if testing the ground. But most impossible of all, Those footsteps came from a place too narrow for anything human-sized to occupy. I didn't run right away. Training overrode instinct for almost a full heartbeat, but instinct eventually won. I backed away first, then walked quickly, then sped into a full, indecent sprint until the trees blurred and my lungs burned. Halfway down the slope, the world felt normal again. Cicadas screamed, birds flicked between branches, the heat wrapped itself around me like a familiar blanket. It should have been reassuring. But when I stopped to breathe, sweat burning my eyes, I heard something I couldn't explain. My own voice, whispering, not in the air around me, no, behind me, far behind me. Back at the cave, repeating the last thing I said before I fled. If you need help, step out. The exact tone, the exact rhythm, like a perfect imitation. Only wrong, like a puppet learning how to talk. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the narrow passage, the darkness twisting, something inside pressing its ear to the rock and listening and listening. And that wasn't the end, it was the beginning. I told myself not to go back up there. Rangers don't chase ghosts. We chase real-world problems, injured hikers, sudden storms, unattended campfires. But the next morning, when the incident report crossed my desk, I felt something inside me tighten. Another group claimed they heard the same thing near the same cave. A father, mother, and teenage daughter out for a sunrise hike. They said they heard a man calling out from inside the rock, asking if anyone could hear him. The mother insisted the voice sounded familiar in a way she couldn't explain. The daughter said the voice sounded like her dad. And the father? He refused to talk. He just stared at the floor, pale as quartz, hands shaking like he'd been out in a blizzard. I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want another minute of that cave in my mind. But something in the daughter's voice, her quiet insistence that the echo knew her dad's name before he said anything, made something in me freeze. Names have weight in the woods. Saying one out loud is like dropping a stone in still water. Something always hears it. By noon, I was climbing Old Rag again, sweat rolling down my arms, the July heat vaporizing any illusion of safety. Each switchback felt tighter, each boulder heavier, like the mountain wanted me to understand it did not welcome my return. When I reached the illegal trail, the woods felt wrong immediately. The air wasn't still enough. It vibrated, not in a supernatural sense, but like the atmosphere itself held its breath. Even the birds were silent. No scraping cicadas, no squirrel chatter. Pure, waiting quiet. I followed the path until the cave came into view, crouching like a mouth keeping its secrets. The memory of yesterday made my chest tighten. Fear wasn't new to me. Fear is part of the job, but this felt different. It felt earned, like the cave had spent the night remembering my voice, preparing something. I took a few steps forward and stopped cold. Tiny pebbles lay scattered at the entrance, not unusual, but they formed a pattern, a jagged half ring, almost like something had dragged its fingers along the ground, pulling stones toward itself. I knelt slowly. The pattern wasn't random. It pointed inward, into the cave. I should have radioed in. I should have waited. But I stepped closer instead. I needed to know, needed to understand what I had heard, needed to confirm I hadn't lost my mind. I stood at the cave's edge, the smell of damp earth pushing into my nostrils. The air was cooler inside, unnaturally cold for mid-July. I raised my flashlight, leaned in, and spoke softly. "I'm here to help. If someone's inside, answer me." My voice rolled into the darkness and then rolled back, exactly as expected. An echo. Normal. I exhaled shakily, letting myself believe maybe yesterday had been a trick of the heat, exhaustion, nerves. Then the echo changed. At first, just a slight warble, a hesitation, a breath added where there was none. I stood still, listening, heart thudding in my ears. "I'm here to help. If someone's inside, side. Then deeper, side. Then distorted, side. Then something else entirely. Something stepped on the word like it was soft clay and reshaped it. I jerked back, nearly dropping my flashlight, breath hammering out of me as the voice continued to warp, lower, rubble-filled, as if the mountain was chewing on the sounds. Then silence fell again. Total. Complete. I knew I should leave. Every instinct screamed for me to run. But just as I turned, something brushed my right shoulder. Not a hand, not a claw. Air. A warm exhale. Close enough to lift the hairs on my neck. I spun around. Nothing was there. But inside the cave, something scraped against stone. Slow. Purposeful. As if whatever was in there wanted me to hear it. Wanted me to fear it. I forced myself backward, step by trembling step, not daring to turn my back. Only when I reached the first bend in the trail did I pivot and walk as quickly as my legs allowed. Halfway down, the normal sounds of the mountain returned. Leaves rustled. A distant crow cawed. The heat pressed close again, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Not from the woods, from beneath them. That night, I went home and told myself I'd report the cave as hazardous and close the area indefinitely. But as darkness fell across the valley, sleep wouldn't come. My mind replayed the distorted echo, the breath on my shoulder, the steps in the narrow passage. And then, at 2:17 a.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. At first, only static. Then, my own voice. Is anyone inside? Not spoken, repeated, dragged, followed by a second voice layered beneath mine. A deeper register. Hungry. Learning. Inside. I hung up so fast my hand shook. I shut off my phone, tossed it across the room, and sat on the edge of my bed, breathing like I'd run a marathon. I knew what Old Rag was doing. It wasn't haunting us. It was mimicking us. But why? What did it want? What lived in that cave? I didn't sleep at all. Before sunrise, I made a decision no ranger should ever make. I went back up the mountain alone. The trail was empty, the woods still shrouded in blue morning light. I didn't let myself hesitate. I forced my legs to carry me up toward the mouth. But when I reached the illegal trail, something was different. Footprints. A single set. Deeper than normal footprints, as if whoever made them carried weight. They shouldn't. They led straight toward the cave. A chill crawled under my skin. I followed them with dread, tightening my throat. The prints stopped right at the cave entrance, 2 inches from the darkness, and beside them was something small, a torn scrap of blue fabric caught on a root. A child's shirt. My lungs felt like they collapsed, that family from yesterday, the daughter in the blue top. Had they come back? Had something called them? I knelt, stretching out my hand to pick up the fabric, and the cave whispered. My name, not echoed, not repeated, spoken, perfectly, soft, inviting. I staggered back, stone cutting my palm as I caught myself. The voice repeated it again, more confidently this time, like it was proud of getting it right. Then, from somewhere deep inside, the unmistakable sound of a little girl crying echoed outward. Not mimicked, real. Panic hit me like a wave. I rushed forward, shouting into the dark, flashlight trembling in my grip. Hold on, I'm coming. But the crying stopped instantly, and a man's voice replaced it. My voice. Hold on, I'm coming. Mocking, taunting. I froze, my entire body locking in place. The forest behind me went silent again. My breathing sounded too loud. The cave waited, patient and open, and then I heard it, something shifting just beyond the turn in the passage. Heavy. Wet. Moving with a deliberate slowness like it wanted me to hear every inch of its approach. My instincts finally broke loose. I ran. Not down the mountain, up, toward the ridge scramble, toward open air, toward sunlight, toward anything that wasn't underground. The mountain seemed to tilt, the rocks slick with sweat and panic. My heartbeat thudded so hard it drowned out everything else, except one thing, the echo that wasn't echoing anymore. It followed me. Footsteps behind me, not on stone, but inside it, like the granite itself was carrying weight. Every few seconds it called out again, trying to match my breathing, trying to mimic my panic, trying to become me. I reached the ridge, stumbling onto sunlit stone, the air so bright it stabbed my eyes. For a long time, I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited for something, anything, to emerge from the trees. Nothing did. Silence settled over the mountain again, natural and familiar this time. But I knew better. Old Rag wasn't finished. It had learned my voice, it had learned my name, and it had almost learned my fear. In the months that followed, I transferred out of Shenandoah. I told my superiors I needed a change of pace, told my colleagues I felt burned out, told my family nothing at all. But some nights, When the world grows quiet and my thoughts drift back to the granite slopes, I swear I can still hear that warped version of my voice calling out through the darkness. Close. Too close. Echoes shouldn't follow you, but some echoes aren't echoes. Some echoes are invitations, and some invitations never stop waiting for you to answer. The night the Everglades swallowed my certainty was the first time I understood that some roads don't take you deeper into the forest. They take you deeper into yourself, into the places you've spent your whole life trying not to look at. I remember the exact moment it began because the silence felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath and waiting for me to finally fail. My name is not important, not anymore, but back then I was a park ranger in my late 30s, working the southern districts near the Lost Loop Road. I grew up out here in Florida's flat, breathing swamps, drifting between the sawgrass, mangroves, and heat-rippled air. Locals always said the Everglades had two faces, the one you see under sunlight and the one that waits for you after dusk. I thought I knew both. I thought knowledge was the same thing as safety. That illusion broke the night I stopped trusting my own instincts. Lost Loop Road wasn't supposed to exist anymore. It was officially closed in the 1990s, mapped out of the public trails because the ground had become unstable, too soft from the rising water table. But locals still whispered about it. They said people who drove down it sometimes came back different, or they didn't come back at all. When you work long enough in these woods, you hear dozens of stories like that. Rest stops where people hear their names whispered from the tree line, trails that loop when they shouldn't, old Seminole burial grounds that make compasses spin. Every forest has its myths, but this one always felt personal, as if the road itself held a grudge. I told myself that was just the Everglades getting under my skin. The air here is thick enough to make sound travel strangely. Animals move like ghosts. Heat bends your vision. And yet, despite all my training, a small part of me always felt watched. Not by panthers or alligators. Something that didn't walk the same way we do. I tried to be the kind of ranger who wasn't afraid to admit being afraid. But fear, real fear, the kind that coils in your ribs and keeps you second-guessing every step you take, that fear had been building in me long before December 2023. Maybe that's why I volunteered for night patrol that week. Maybe I needed to feel useful. Or maybe I was trying to silence something inside me before it grew roots. My shift started normally. I checked the gates, the riverside pull-offs, the abandoned docks. December nights in the Everglades are deceptive. Cool air lures you into thinking you're safe. I kept the windows of the Ranger SUV cracked just enough for the night sounds to slip in. Frogs, crickets, sawgrass brushing in soft waves, a barred owl far off to the east. For a moment, everything felt right. Then the radio crackled, a short burst, not static, breathing, wet, heavy breathing. Then a thump like someone hitting metal. I sat up straighter. Dispatch, do you copy? No answer. The radio hissed like something was exhaling directly into the speaker. This wasn't my first strange radio night. Sometimes atmospheric interference warped signals. But what froze me was the faint, rhythmic tapping behind the noise. Not random, not mechanical. 3 taps, pause. 2 taps, long pause. 3 taps again. A pattern, a code, a warning. I didn't know why I whispered when I said, "Is someone there?" The tapping stopped instantly. And then, from behind the SUV, I heard the exact same pattern on the back window. 3 taps, 2 taps, 3 taps. Slow and deliberate. I turned in my seat, heart climbing up my throat. The rear window was black, pitch black, even though I had left my headlights on. I couldn't see any outline, any shadow, just darkness swallowing the glass. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a curious deer. But every instinct in me tightened as though gripping a knife. The Everglades teaches you to trust your body before your brain. I started the engine again and rolled forward, putting distance between myself and whatever had tapped on the glass. For a few minutes, I tried to pretend I imagined it. Tired minds conjure things. Stress shapes the dark into threats. I forced myself to breathe steadily. But then I looked in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was gone, not faded by darkness, gone. Instead of a straight gravel path, the headlights showed a field of sawgrass as if the road had never existed. But I had just driven there. I slammed on the brakes and stared, pulse roaring in my ears. I should have radioed it in, but the radio was still dead. That's when I noticed the humidity had changed. The inside of the SUV felt colder, like the air was being pulled backward through the vents. The windshield fogged slightly, even though the night was dry. Then the smell hit, a sour, metallic scent, the smell of wet fur and copper. Animal, but wrong, too strong, too intentional, like whatever made it wanted me to know it was there. I wiped the fog glass with my sleeve. A handprint, huge, long-fingered, slowly appeared in the condensation, but it wasn't on the inside, it was pressed from the outside. I jumped, banging my knee into the steering column. My breath hitched. The glass vibrated lightly as though something was dragging its palm across it. The print smeared downward, slow, deliberate, too slow to be wind, too smooth to be human. My mind scrambled. Panther? No. Alligator? Impossible. Bear? Not in this part of the state. And nothing in the Everglades had hands. Nothing that was supposed to exist. The smear reached the bottom of the glass. My heartbeat pounded in my throat. I tried the radio again. Dispatch. Emergency code yellow. Do you copy? Only static. But this time beneath the static, something else formed. A voice, not words. Just the cadence of someone mimicking human speech, like an animal trying to imitate a language it didn't understand. Low. Breath heavy. Too close. I swallowed hard and turned the SUV around. I needed to get out. I needed to find the nearest main road. I needed distance between me and whatever was pressing its massive hand against my vehicle. But when I turned the wheel, headlights swept across something standing at the edge of the clearing. Tall. Still. Covered in dark, wet hair that clung to its limbs. Eyes reflecting back at me, amber, unblinking. Then another shape stepped beside it. And another. Not animals. Not men. Something in between. My lungs locked. I felt my vision sharpen unnaturally as adrenaline flooded in. The creatures didn't move. They only watched. Bodies too long, torsos too broad, arms dangling past their knees. Their silhouettes quivered slightly, as if the heat around them distorted the air. And then a fourth appeared behind my SUV, a fifth near the cypress trees. They circled the vehicle without sound, a ring of towering shadows, and every instinct in me began screaming the same message: you should never have come to Lost Loop Road. They didn't rush me. That was the part that terrified me most. Predators have rhythms: stalk, approach, attack. But these creatures simply stood there, their massive frames absorbing the moonlight, their breaths thick enough to fog the night air. They moved with the patience of something that had learned long ago it never needed to hurry. The Everglades had taught me every noise in this ecosystem, and what surrounded my SUV didn't belong to any of them. Their stillness felt intelligent, calculated, as if they were assessing me. The one closest to the driver's side stepped a fraction forward, its long foot pressing into the mud, water filling the sunken print. The shape of it was wrong, longer than a man's, but narrower than an ape's. I stared, frozen, my fingers numb against the steering wheel. A strange sensation crawled through my chest. Not just fear, recognition. Something about the way these things watched me, as though I wasn't a threat, but a problem to solve. I had spent my life on these lands. I had seen every creature that stalked these swamps. But never once had something looked at me the way they did. Without caution, without curiosity. They looked at me the way a human looks at an insect in their home. The radio crackled again, loud enough to make me jump. This time, the static didn't mask the sound. It sharpened it. A ragged inhale. A low, deliberate exhale. And then a whisper, stretched thin. Stay. The voice was wrong. Too deep. Too broken. It sounded like it was trying to form the word, like the throat producing it wasn't built for speech. The creatures didn't react to the voice, as if they already knew what it would say. I shifted into drive. My foot hovered over the gas. That tiny movement changed everything. 3 of the creatures snapped their heads toward me in perfect unison. I froze again, teeth clenched, lungs barely able to move. Their eyes glinted gold under my headlights, glowing the way alligator eyes do at night, but wider, more human in the spacing. Their chests rose and fell slowly, calmly, but every muscle under their fur stayed taut. I pressed the gas. The SUV lurched forward. The creature nearest the hood moved so fast I barely processed the motion. One moment it was standing, the next it was leaning forward, placing its massive hand on the hood with a soft, heavy thud. The metal groaned under the pressure. It wasn't trying to grab me. It was stopping the vehicle. And it succeeded. The engine strained, tires spun in the mud, but the SUV didn't move an inch. It was like driving into a wall made of muscle and instinct. The creature's amber eyes flicked up, meeting mine through the windshield. Its breath misted the glass. Another stepped closer to the passenger window. Another behind me. I was trapped. I killed the engine without meaning to, my shaking hands twisting the keys in pure panic. The sudden silence was suffocating. My heartbeat thundered so loudly I felt dizzy. The night around me shifted. The Everglades, usually an orchestra of frogs, insects, owls, fell completely mute. That was when I realized I wasn't just surrounded. I was being hunted by something that hunted in organized silence. The creature at the hood slowly lifted its palm, dragging claws, no, not claws, but thick, dark nails across the metal. The scraping sound vibrated through my bones. I felt like a child in a nightmare, powerless and waiting for someone to shake me awake. My mind grasped for logic. Maybe they were some undocumented primates, a mutated bear family, a disease-altering behavior, anything to keep my sanity from tipping. But when the creature behind me exhaled, a deep, rumbling grunt that vibrated the SUV, I knew instinctively these things were older than any science I understood, and somehow that they understood me. I whispered to myself, "Breathe. Just breathe." The cold air inside the vehicle thickened. I felt something press against the back window again. A hand dragging slowly across the glass. I heard it this time, a damp, sticky glide. My throat tightened. Then the creatures began circling. Not walking, not wandering, circling. Their steps didn't splash in the shallow water. They didn't crush twigs. They didn't so much as disturb the mud. They moved like shadows wearing bodies, their silhouettes blending into the dark trees before emerging again. One passed behind the SUV, another drifted sideways, keeping its gaze locked on mine. Another leaned its elongated torso directly toward the passenger window. They moved in a slow spiral around the vehicle, a tightening spiral, and with every loop they came closer. I fumbled for the spotlight mounted on the SUV's roof. My fingers found the wire. I hesitated. Every instinct told me shining a bright light on them would escalate things, but so would doing nothing. I flipped the switch. The beam sliced through the dark. The creature closest to the passenger window threw its arm over its face, not in pain, but annoyance. A thick growl rumbled from its throat, deep enough to shake the glass. The others reacted differently. The one in front of the SUV tilted its head and stared directly into the beam, unblinking. Its pupils contracted, then expanded unnaturally, like it was assessing the light rather than recoiling from it. The one behind me let out a strange, low whistle, a trilling call that reverberated across the clearing, echoing off trees that shouldn't have been able to reflect sound. The whistle repeated, then warped into something that made my blood pulse cold. It sounded like laughter, not human laughter, far too guttural, but the rhythm was unmistakable. The Everglades have always been an echo chamber. But nothing should laugh like that out here. The creature near the window pressed its palm against the glass and slid it downward, smearing mud and some darker substance across the surface. Its arm muscles rippled under the matted fur. The hand was nearly as wide as my torso. I reached for the gear shift. If I could break free, even for a second, I could reverse and try to... A thud hit the roof. Heavy, dense, like an entire body dropped from above. The SUV shook violently. I flinched and looked up through the windshield. Mud dripped from the roof's edge. Something was on top of the vehicle. Then claws, actual claws, curved and bone-colored, scratched slowly across the metal roof. Sparks flickered as nail met steel. My throat burned with adrenaline. "Get off the car," I whispered shakily, though I had no idea what I was talking to, or why I thought it could understand. The creature on the roof exhaled deeply. The sound vibrated through the entire frame, long, rumbling, almost thoughtful. Then it leaned its weight forward, causing the front suspension to dip as though it were inspecting me from above. The spotlight flickered, the power stuttered, the air grew colder still, and then something impossible happened. The silence broke, but not with an animal call. A voice pressed through the radio again, clearer this time, strained as if dragged from a throat not meant for speech. "Don't. Run." I stared at the radio, lips parted, chest locked. The voice wasn't just mimicking human words, it was learning them. Outside, the creatures tighten their circle, their hunting pattern, their closing, their claiming, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to become prey in a place I once believed I protected. The radio went dead again, but the echo of that broken voice, "Don't run," kept vibrating in my skull. It felt less like a warning and more like a command. Outside, the creature's slow spiral tightened until their shapes formed a dense wall of moving shadow. I couldn't see the road anymore. I couldn't see anything except their shifting silhouettes and the faint glints of their eyes. The one on the roof adjusted its weight. The SUV groaned beneath it. My pulse hammered so violently that I felt my vision pulse with it. The creatures didn't look impatient. They didn't look unsure. They looked like they had all the time in the world, and they were deciding what kind of night this was going to be. I don't know what part of me refused to give in, but something old and instinctual clawed its way up through the panic. Not courage, not reason. Just a raw, almost feral refusal to disappear on a road that wasn't supposed to exist. I reached slowly toward the ignition, praying the movement wouldn't trigger them. The creature at the passenger window followed the motion with its amber eyes, its breath fogging the side glass in slow, heavy bursts. Its head tilted slightly, as if weighing my intent. When my fingers brushed the keys, the creature at the hood leaned in. Its long arms dragged across the dirt, the muscles beneath the fur tightening. The warning was clear. It saw everything, every twitch, every breath, every attempt at escape. But I turned the key anyway. The engine sputtered, choked, then roared to life. The creature on the roof jerked its head down, reacting to the vibration. The one at the hood pressed its palm flat against the metal again, shoulder muscles bulging as it tried to counter the machine. The engine strained, whining with effort. I slammed my foot on the accelerator. Mud kicked up behind me. The SUV lurched forward half a foot, maybe less. But that half foot was enough. The creature's hand slipped off the hood for a moment, and in that breath of freedom, I twisted the wheel, slamming into reverse. The vehicle jerked back violently, skidding through the waterlogged earth. The creature on the roof growled, an ear-splitting, guttural sound, its claws raking deep grooves into the metal as it struggled to hold its position. One of the creatures swung around behind the SUV, but the sudden movement of the vehicle caught it off guard. I floored the gas. The tires spun wildly, then found purchase just long enough to propel me backward through the clearing. I didn't look at the creatures. I looked at the one thing I hoped still existed, the outline of a road. But where the road had been before, there was only darkness and sawgrass. No trail, no gravel, no man-made shape. Just wilderness and water stretching endlessly. My heart slammed into my ribs. I didn't know if I had driven off the path without realizing it, or if the path had truly vanished behind me. The Everglades can distort your sense of direction at night, but this felt different, like the land itself had shifted. In the rearview mirror, a figure lunged. Its hand struck the back window with a thunderous crack. Spidering fractures shot across the glass, the impact shaking the entire SUV. The creature on the roof roared again, a long, angry bellow that shook the air around me. It sounded like it wasn't just attacking. It sounded frustrated. I yanked the wheel again, spinning the SUV sideways. The creature lost its footing and slipped across the roof, claws carving long, curving streaks before it slid off the edge and dropped into the mud with a sickening thud. I hit the spotlight switch again. flooding the clearing with harsh white light. For the first time, the creatures reacted with genuine emotion, fear. They recoiled, not violently, but sharply, instinctively. Their eyes flashed as the beam hit them. Their bodies curled slightly inward. The one that fell rolled onto all fours, shaking its head in disoriented anger, but not coming any closer. The spotlight wasn't hurting them, but it exposed them, made them visible, and visibility seemed to break the spell they held over the land. I kept the beam sweeping, steadying it despite my shaking hands. The creatures hesitated, exchanging glances, actual glances, like they were communicating silently. The one in front stepped backward, its massive foot sinking into the muck. Another followed, then another. They weren't retreating. They were repositioning, waiting for the beam to slip. The creature behind me lunged again, hitting the SUV with its shoulder. The vehicle rocked violently, nearly flipping. My head slammed into the window frame, pain exploding across my skull. The spotlight wavered, and 3 creatures surged forward instantly. I jammed the transmission into drive and floored the accelerator. The SUV shot forward, bouncing across uneven ground, water spraying in sheets on either side. The creatures lunged to intercept, slaughter, but the spotlight stayed trained on them. They hesitated again, snarling in frustration. The path finally appeared ahead, barely visible, distorted, but real enough to recognize. Lost Loop Road, or what was left of it. I aimed for the shadowed corridor between the tall grasses. Branches slapped the windows. Mud splashed violently against the doors. The engine roared in protest. I didn't know if the road would collapse beneath me, if the waterlogged earth would swallow the wheels whole. But stopping wasn't an option. A thud slammed into the rear quarter panel. Another creature. Then another. They were giving chase now. Their heavy footfalls thudded through the ground, shaking the soil. Their screams, deep, guttural, unearthly, echoed through the swamp. They weren't trying to circle me anymore. They were trying to drag me down. The spotlight flickered as their shadows passed it, the beam struggling to cut through the humid air. I gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles bone white, eyes locked on the faint strip of road ahead. The trees pressed close, their branches hanging low like skeletal arms. Then, through the radio, soft, warped, almost pleading, "Stop." A cold dread crawled up my spine. The voice wasn't warning me. It wanted me still. I could feel it. This wasn't a random encounter. I wasn't prey. I was being pulled into something older, something territorial. Something that understood that fear was more powerful when it didn't kill you immediately. The SUV hit a rise of land and bounced hard. The creature closest to the vehicle leapt, slamming its hand onto the back window again. The cracked glass bowed inward, seconds from breaking. I screamed, slamming the brakes. The creature flew forward, momentum carrying it past the SUV. It crashed into the brush with a monstrous growl, tearing through vines and branches. I didn't wait. I shifted back into drive and hit the accelerator again. For a brief moment, the road opened ahead, widening just enough for me to gather speed. My headlights cut through the mist rising from the wetlands. The trees thinned, the air changed, and suddenly the creatures stopped. All of them. The forest behind me went silent, but not like before, not an unnatural vacuum of sound, just the normal quiet of night. I kept driving until I burst onto the main service road, the gravel crunching under my tires like salvation. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, stumbling inside with adrenaline still shaking my bones. But the thing that haunts me most didn't happen out there. It happened 3 hours later. When I stepped outside to check the vehicle, on the hood, smeared in mud and streaked water, were marks I didn't want to understand. Not handprints, symbols. 3 long vertical lines, 2 short ones, 3 long again. The same pattern that tapped on my window, the same rhythm that followed me home. I cleaned the hood before my supervisor arrived. I said nothing in my interview report. I told no one what happened on Lost Loop Road, but the pattern stayed burned behind my eyelids every night after. And sometimes when the wind shifts across the swamp, low and wet, I swear I can hear those things breathing again. And I know in my bones they let me leave, not because I escaped, but because they weren't finished with me yet. I've always believed that the desert keeps its own kind of silence, an old, ancient quiet that doesn't belong to us. But on the night I first saw the pale man, when the canyon winds stopped and even the ravens refused to call out, I learned that silence can turn into something predatory. It can lean in, it can breathe, and it can listen to everything you fear. My name is not important, but my work is. I'm a ranger in one of the loneliest, most unforgiving corners of Utah, Dead Horse Point State Park. As of April 2019, I was 37 years old, weathered by desert winds and the kind of solitude most people only think they want. Out there, surrounded by cliff edges and open sky, you can go weeks without hearing a voice you didn't bring with you. Some days it feels like freedom. Other days, it feels like the beginning of a slow unraveling. I worked the night shift more often than not. I preferred it. The stars above Dead Horse Point are so sharp, they feel like they could cut you open if you stare too hard. The mesas stretch for miles in the moonlight, full of silent drop-offs and thin trails that wind through the red rock like scars. Local Navajo families sometimes warn us about wandering after dark. They talk about old beings, watchers, things half remembered from stories passed down around winter fires. As a ranger, you're trained to nod respectfully, log the discussion, and continue forward with your rational mind intact. But the land does something to you. It pushes logic right up to the brink. Sometimes it even nudges. Back then, I still believed I understood the land well enough to be safe. My trouble began with a complaint, a simple one. A hiker named Mick Ruiz radioed in around dusk, barely out of breath, but with a tone in his voice that made me straighten up. He claimed something was moving through the brush near the trail to the overlook. Not an animal, he insisted. Something big, too tall to be a cougar, too quiet to be a person. I remember standing outside the small ranger station, the wind cooling off just enough to feel like a whisper against my skin. Mick described what he'd seen as pale, not white like stone, pale like something that had never learned what sunlight was. The desert teaches you not to dismiss people. It also teaches you that fear is a radio signal, weak at first, then rising, then suddenly crystal clear. I grabbed my pack, my light, and my sidearm and headed toward the trail. It was one of those dusky hours when color drains fast. Reds dissolve into muted browns, and every shadow looks like a doorway leading somewhere you shouldn't step. My boots crunched over the sand and gravel as I walked, and each footfall felt too loud. The wind had died, no rustling brush, no distant howl, nothing. It should not have been that quiet. People romanticize the desert, but most have never been alone with it long enough to hear its heartbeat. When the land stops moving, when every living thing chooses to hide, that is not peace. That is warning. Mick was waiting for me at the trailhead with his wife, who didn't say much but kept glancing toward the canyon rim as if expecting something to appear there at any second. They were pale, uneasy, but not hysterical. They weren't making this up. I led them back to their vehicle and told them I'd check on the area. As soon as their engine faded, I felt the first prickling along my spine. Something about being alone again made the trail look different. Narrower, darker, almost distorted by the dying light. My flashlight carved out a white beam across the brush, catching on the sandstone walls and dried sage. I remember breathing slowly, evenly, the way we're trained. But training only grounds you when the world follows rules. I was maybe 50 yards down the trail when I caught the first sound, something soft, deliberate. Footsteps, but spaced out oddly, like the gait wasn't made for human legs, a kind of uneven grace. I froze. The sound came again. Left, right, pause, scrape. I lifted the light, angling it toward the thicker brush near the bend. The beam shook more than I wanted to admit. I told myself it was probably a deer. This is what we do to keep the mind from spiraling. We label things, we categorize the unknown. We pretend it fits inside a box we've seen before. Then something stood up behind the brush, not an animal, not with that height. My light caught a piece of it, skin that wasn't really skin, more like stretched clay, smooth, pale, hairless. I only saw a shoulder and the curved rise of a neck before it sank back down again with a movement that looked almost ashamed. I felt a coldness spread inside my ribs, slow and deliberate. I called out, voice firm, steady. "Who's there?" Nothing answered. The temperature dropped. I felt it like a sudden exhale against my cheek, damp and cold, impossibly cold for April. My breath fogged faintly. That only happens in the pre-dawn hours, never right after sunset. I took one step forward, and then came the sound that will haunt me for as long as I breathe. A knock. Not on wood, not on metal. A knock on stone. 3 taps, slow and deliberate, coming from inside the narrow slit of shadow between 2 boulders. A cave entrance I'd never noticed. The kind of opening you only see when something inside wants you to. The echo carried strangely, too rounded, too full, as if the stone itself had lungs. I should have retreated right then. Every instinct in my body screamed to back away. But fear messes with your pride, especially when you're trained to protect other people. I stepped toward the sound, shining the beam deeper into the crack, and something leaned forward from the darkness. A face, too long, barely shaped, pale like chalk washed by moonlight, no hair, no eyebrows, no lips, just a thin slit where a mouth should have been. And eyes, dark, wet, and open too wide, like someone who had forgotten how blinking worked. It didn't rush me. It didn't growl. It simply watched. I lifted my sidearm with a shaking hand. The pale man tilted its head, slow and curious, almost childlike, like it was examining a creature it had never seen before. Then, impossibly, it knocked again. 3 taps against the inside of its cave wall, deliberate and measured. My heart slammed so hard I felt it in my throat. I stumbled backward, light flaring wildly across the canyon. The creature sank back into the dark like melting wax, its shape dissolving into the crevice as though it belonged to the stone. Like it had been carved there long before humans ever walked these trails. I ran. My breath tore through my chest as I sprinted down the path, the world narrowing to nothing but the crunch of gravel and the sound of my own pulse. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I only stopped when the lights of the ranger station finally glowed through the dark, small, and fragile like a lighthouse barely holding back a storm. But even then, with the safety of walls and lights around me, I felt watched. I felt followed. I felt remembered. And that was only the beginning. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pale man leaning forward from that slit in the rock, its expression frozen between curiosity and hunger. Or maybe it wasn't hunger. Maybe it was recognition. That was the part that unsettled me most. The inevitability in its stare, like something in that cave had been waiting for me. When dawn finally bled over the messes, I dragged myself outside. Morning in Dead Horse Point usually feels clean, fresh, sharp with desert air. But that day, the sun felt wrong, too dim, as if the night had left fingerprints across the sky. The sand looked disturbed near the trailhead, small drag marks I hadn't noticed before. I told myself they could have come from deer hooves or wind, but the pattern was too smooth, like something heavy had been pulled gently along the ground. I reported the incident to my supervisor in the driest, most procedural way possible. Possible trespasser near the west overlook. Suspicious movement, unusual behavior, no confrontation. If I had said what I truly saw, they'd have either laughed or sent me home to rest. Neither option felt useful. I returned to the area after sunrise with a junior ranger named Ken. He was 24, eager and painfully rational. The kind of ranger who needed every story to end with a clear and simple explanation. We marked our way down the trail and reached the boulder crevice. I stopped a few yards back. Ken didn't notice at first. He walked right up to the opening, shining his light inside. I watched his shoulders stiffen slightly, but he didn't step back. "You see anything?" I asked. "Just rocks." "No signs of habitation," he said. His voice kept its usual steadiness, but I noticed his free hand brushing across his pant leg over and over, like he was quietly wiping off something unpleasant. I forced myself to approach. In the daylight, the crack looked unremarkable, just a narrow split between 2 weathered boulders. But when I stepped into its shadow, A cold thread of air slid across my neck. Too cold for desert morning. Ken's light reached only a few feet inside before the darkness swallowed it. The interior drank the beam instead of reflecting it, like a throat that wanted to gulp down every inch of light we offered. I crouched. The ground was smooth, not dusty like a natural cave floor, smoother than it should have been. Worn down, as if something had walked there. Many times. A faint, almost sour smell drifted outward. Not decay, not animal musk. Something more sterile, almost chemical. Like clay mixed with old water and a hint of something metallic. We left without a word. Back at the station, Ken didn't ask about the report. He didn't make small talk. He just kept rubbing his hands together and glancing toward the window, as though expecting someone or something to pass by. For the next week, incidents trickled in from visitors. Not enough to raise alarms, but enough to form a pattern. Strange tapping heard on tent poles at night. A pale shape seen near the rim trails, footsteps that stopped when people turned around. A hiker who insisted something followed him for half a mile, never visible, but close enough to hear its breathing. That last detail shook me because I'd felt the same cold breath on my cheek that night. I wanted to warn him, to acknowledge it, but the words locked in my throat. I didn't want to be the ranger who validated the impossible. Still, I couldn't ignore what was happening. One night, near the end of April, fog rolled into the canyon. Fog is rare at Dead Horse Point. It doesn't behave like mist in the mountains or haze in low valleys. Fog in the desert moves like it's searching for something. That evening, it crept along the ground, slow and heavy, like a living thing that had learned patience. I was scheduled for a perimeter check, and the moment I stepped into the fog, I felt a shift, a low, humming pressure in the air, like standing inside a heartbeat. My radio crackled with static, even though I had just tested it. My flashlight beam thinned, dissolving into the gray smother around me. People talk about fear rising in them. Mine sank deeper instead, settled into my bones like cold water. There's a trail near the overlook called Raven's Loop. It's not long, but it twists between boulders in a way that makes you feel like you're being funneled. That's where I heard the first sound. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Pause. The same uneven rhythm I'd heard that first night. I turned slowly, breath dragged tight in my chest. The fog thickened behind me and shapes started forming inside it. Tall, thin silhouettes that weren't moving but weren't solid either. I blinked hard. The shapes didn't disappear. My hand hovered over my sidearm. Even in that moment, I knew a weapon wouldn't matter. You can't fight something that moves like a shadow leaning forward. Scrape. Pause. Closer now. I aimed my light into the fog, but the beam seemed to bend around something, like it hit an invisible figure that refused illumination. A faint outline took shape. The curve of a shoulder, the elongated slope of a head, the pale suggestion of a face tilted slightly, expectantly. I stepped back. The figure stepped forward. A whisper of air brushed my ear, dry, cool, almost questioning. I spun around, shaking. Nothing behind me. My radio crackled again, and through the static I heard a single distorted knock. 3 taps. Slow, deliberate. The pale man was calling. My throat tightened. Everything inside me urged retreat, but my legs refused to obey. I felt pinned, held by something just beyond comprehension, as if the fog itself was waiting for me to answer. Then a shape broke the stillness. Ken. He emerged from the opposite side of the fog, flashlight trembling, his eyes wide and unblinking. He saw me, then the shape beside me. He whispered my name, barely sound, barely breath, and the pale man turned toward him. I felt a pressure shift, something heavy passing through the air between us. Ken stumbled back, slipping on the slick red dust. The pale man leaned, its neck bending too far, too fluid, like bone wasn't part of its anatomy. Then it stepped fully out of the fog. I only saw it for a single second, but that second carved itself into my memory deeper than any wound. Its limbs were wrong. Not long, but stretched, like someone had pulled them gently to see how far flesh could go. Its chest rose and fell in slow, gaping movements. Its eyes glistened, not with moisture, but with a faint, reflective film, like the eyes of something that lived underground where light never reached. Ken scrambled backward, feet slipping again. I grabbed his arm, hauling him up. The pale man took one slow step toward us. The ground vibrated as it moved, just slightly, but enough that dust lifted from the stones around our boots, and from somewhere deep inside the canyon walls a low sound answered. A resonance like two caves calling to each other across time. That was when panic finally took control. We ran, not with ranger discipline, not with measured strides. We ran like prey, crashing through the fog, scraping past boulders, tripping over roots that felt like hands reaching up from the earth. Behind me, the scrape, pause, scrape rhythm kept pace, impossibly smooth on the rocky ground. It wasn't chasing, it was following, confident, predictable, as if the outcome had already been decided. When we finally burst through the last layer of fog near the station lights, the sound stopped. Just stopped, cut off like a severed string. Ken collapsed near the steps, gasping. I dropped beside him. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. When we finally looked back, the fog stared at us, thick, unmoving, a wall of gray that held its shape too well. And somewhere deep inside it, something shifted. Watching. Waiting. I knew then what the pale man wanted. Not our lives, our attention, our acknowledgement, our fear. The cave had been waiting for me that first night. Now the thing inside it wanted more, and I wasn't sure I could keep pretending it wasn't real. I didn't tell anyone that night what I truly believed, that the pale man wasn't wandering. It wasn't lost. It wasn't looking for food or shelter. It was reaching out, testing boundaries. And somehow, I had become the line it wanted to cross. Over the next 2 days, the park felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Animals vanished from their usual paths. Deer prints stopped abruptly at the edges of thickets, as if the creatures had turned back without reason. Ravens circled lower than usual, silent, wings sweeping soundlessly over the sandstone. Even the wind seemed to carry a different pitch, less like breeze and more like whispering breath. Ken didn't return to work. His partner called in a sick day for him, but the quiver in her voice over the phone made it obvious he wasn't sick. He was afraid. I tried to keep my shifts normal. Routine is a life raft in places like Dead Horse Point. If you keep walking the trails, keep checking the posts, keep logging your hours, you can convince yourself the desert still belongs to reason. But reason doesn't mean anything when the land itself seems complicit. On the evening of April 29th, I decided to confront my fear head-on. I packed my gear and headed straight back to Raven's Loop. I told myself it was my duty to investigate, to secure the area, to prove nothing supernatural was happening. But deep down, I knew what I really wanted. Answers. Fear has a way of turning you into something reckless. It makes you believe that confronting the source will give you back your power. The sky was fading when I reached the overlook. The last orange light dripped over the canyon walls, stretching shadows into long, finger-like shapes that reached toward the trail. I stood still, letting the hush settle into my ears. A faint smell drifted past, cold clay and water that had never seen the sun. The pale man's scent. I tightened my grip on my flashlight. The device felt suddenly fragile in my hand, like a child's toy. But I turned it on anyway, pushing deeper along the bend where the fog had swallowed us 2 nights earlier. The trail narrowed, the air cooled, and then I noticed something new. Small markings on the ground. Not footprints, not drag marks, lines. Thin, shallow lines carved into the red dust, arranged in strange looping curves, spirals, circles, repetitive shapes drawn again and again. They looked like someone had traced them in the earth with long, bony fingers. I crouched down, heart thudding. The lines weren't random. They repeated, as if some creature without language had tried desperately to communicate its thoughts in patterns. My breath caught when I realized the shapes weren't just scribbles. They matched the exact pattern of the cave entrance. The pale man was drawing home into the ground. Why? A warning? An invitation? A claim? Before I could form an answer, a soft sound drifted from behind the boulders. A breath, long and shaking. I stood, flashlight trembling. The beam cut across the rocks, and that was when I saw him. Ken, He was wedged between two stone columns, half crouched, face pale, eyes wide and empty. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Dirt smeared his uniform. His hands shook as they'd forgotten how to stay still. He stared at me like I wasn't entirely real. I moved toward him slowly, careful not to spook him. "Ken, it's me. What are you doing out here?" His lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, he lifted one hand, pointed past me toward the deeper part of the trail. His fingers shook uncontrollably. Then he whispered, barely audible. It followed me home. I felt a chill race through my spine. "What followed you?" He swallowed hard, eyes glassy. It knocked on my door 3 times. My stomach knotted. The pale man's rhythm. Ken's voice cracked as he spoke again. I thought it was wind, or kids. I looked through the window. Nothing was there. I could smell it. Clay. Water. Cold. I felt my breath shudder. "How long has it been following you?" His answer was a small, broken whisper. "Since that night in the fog." He looked down at his hands. His fingers were stained with red dust and something white and powdery, like mineral residue. "It wants something," he said. "It keeps trying to show me." "Show you what?" He shook his head slowly. "The cave isn't just a cave. It's older than this place. Older than the canyon. Older than anything people ever walked on." I stared at him, pulse racing. He wasn't lying. He was slipping. Whatever he'd seen, whatever followed him home, had unraveled something inside him. Before I could speak again, the air shifted, just slightly, but enough. A cold whisper of wind brushed the back of my neck. Ken's eyes widened. His head snapped toward the shadows beyond the boulders. "It's here," he whispered. My flashlight flickered. The canyon fell silent. Then came the knock. 3 taps against stone, deep and hollow, resonating through the rock like a heartbeat inside a tomb. Ken flinched violently, curling inward. I stepped in front of him instinctively. My pulse hammered. Every breath felt tight and shallow. The knock came again, this time closer. I raised my flashlight and aimed it toward the closest crevice. The beam trembled across the shadows, then caught something pale. A hand. Long. Thin. Almost translucent. Its fingers pressed flat against the stone as if feeling for cracks. The joints bent wrong, curving too far, too fluid, like cartilage without bone. Then the hand slid upward, slow and deliberate, scraping lightly as it moved. Another hand joined it. Then a face emerged from the dark. The pale man leaned forward, its movements soft and liquid, as if it were floating just above the ground. Its eyes shimmered faintly, reflecting the flashlight in a way that made the pupils look bottomless. It tilted its head at us. Not with aggression, with interest, recognition. A low vibration trembled through the rock beneath our feet. I realized with a nauseating clarity that the sound wasn't coming from the creature. It was coming from deeper inside the cave network behind it. Something else was moving. Something bigger. The pale man stepped forward, not fast, not slow, exactly measured, exactly controlled, exactly inevitable. Its mouth, just a thin slit, pulled open slightly. Not enough for teeth, just enough for breath to escape. A cold wave of air pressed against my chest. Behind me, Ken whispered something I'll never forget. "It's not one of them. It's the messenger." The ground shook subtly. Dust trickled from the canyon walls. A deep hum rolled through the stone like a warning. The pale man lifted one finger, pointed at me. Then it tapped its fingertip against its own chest. 3 times. My flashlight dimmed, battery dropping faster than physics should allow. The canyon darkened. The pale man's form blurred at the edges like heat haze, except it wasn't warm. The air felt like winter water. Ken grabbed my sleeve hard enough to hurt. "We have to run. Now." But I couldn't move. Not because I was frozen in fear, though fear certainly played its part. I couldn't move because the pale man had taken one more step forward, and now I could see it clearly. Its skin wasn't skin, it was stone. Clay-soft stone, moving like flesh. It was made from the cave. And whatever lived deeper inside wanted me. The pale man's long hand reached outward. The hum in the canyon rose to a low, trembling roar. Ken yanked my arm, screaming for me to run. And finally, my body obeyed. We tore through the trail, crashing across rock and brush, lungs burning, vision tunneling. The creature didn't chase. but the humming grew louder, as if the very walls of the canyon had begun to awaken. When we reached the station lights, Ken collapsed again, sobbing in a way I'd never heard from any ranger. I turned back toward the trail. The pale man stood at the edge of the darkness, half shadow, half stone, perfectly still. Watching, waiting, inviting. I knew its message now. It wasn't done with me. It never had been. And something inside that cave, something far older, far hungrier, wanted me to follow. That night, I sat alone in the ranger station long after Ken had been taken home by his partner. The desert outside the windows was black as pitch, moonless, silent. Even the insects had retreated, leaving the world around me hollow and waiting. I kept the lights low. Something in me believed brightness would only draw it closer, the way moths flock to a flame. Still, every shadow in the corners of the room looked deeper than it should, darker than walls were capable of being. The pale man never needed light to see. It saw through stone, through darkness, through fear. I knew I couldn't keep running from the truth. Not anymore. Not when the creature pointed at me like it was marking something that belonged to it. My fear wasn't the raw panic from the first encounter anymore. It was something older, deeper. Awareness. That I was already tied to that cave, already marked the moment I shined my light into its throat of stone. The pale man didn't choose me randomly. It chose me because I stepped toward it. Now it wanted me to finish walking. Just after midnight, a sound cracked the silence. 3 taps. Not outside. Not on the window. Not even on the door. The knocks came from under the floor. My breath stopped. For a moment, the world narrowed into a thin band of pressure around my chest. The boards beneath my boots vibrated, faint but unmistakable, with each tap echoing like the beating of a second heart hidden inside the building. A coldness spread through the station, drawing itself up the walls, across the desk, under my hands. I rose slowly, stepping back as the knocking resolved into a rhythm so familiar it felt carved into my bones. The pale man had found me. Not outside, here. The lights flickered. My radio hissed with static, and then a voice, distorted, stretched thin by interference, rasped through the speaker. Come back. 2 words. Barely human. Barely sound at all. The radio went dead. My hands trembled uncontrollably. I told myself I wouldn't go, that I wasn't that foolish. But fear has gravity, and when something pulls hard enough, you start moving whether you want to or not. If I stayed inside, it would keep knocking. If I ran, it would follow. If I hid, the cave would find a new way to reach me. Some part of me understood it wasn't the pale man I needed to fear the most. It was the thing behind him, the thing that hummed through the canyon walls, the thing that made the ground vibrate, the thing that breathed cold water into the air, the thing that carved messengers from stone and clay and darkness. And it wanted me. So I stepped outside. The desert greeted me with a dead stillness, like the moment before a storm. My flashlight beam cut only a short path across the sand, everything beyond it swallowed by a darkness that felt dense, almost tangible, like walking through unlit water. I followed the trail, not because I was brave, not because I was curious, but because the land pulled me, the way a tide pulls at a drowned body. Every footstep felt heavier than the last. At Raven's Loop, the night swallowed the path completely. My ears rang with silence. A thin column of moonlight pierced the fogless sky at last, landing directly on the boulder crevice where I had first seen the pale man. And there he stood, tall, still, head tilted slightly, as if listening to the sound of my fear. His body reflected the moonlight faintly, like polished stone. His eyes shimmered like wet obsidian. He didn't move as I approached, not forward, not backward. He simply existed, patient, inevitable. The ground trembled beneath my boots. A low hum rolled through the canyon, not loud but deep, so deep my ribs vibrated with it. Dust lifted in faint spirals, rolled toward the cave as though pulled by some unseen current. The pale man stepped aside, an invitation. My breath hitched. Every instinct screamed for me to run. But the hum deepened again, and suddenly I felt it, like a hand pressing gently but firmly between my shoulder blades. A push. I took a step forward. Inside the crevice, Cold air seeped out like the exhale of something that had slept too long. The cave smelled of ancient water and dust untouched for centuries. The darkness inside did not move. It waited. I hesitated, one last fragment of reason clawing at my mind. But the pale man lifted his arm slowly and pointed deeper into the cave. Not at himself. At me. My throat tightened. I stepped inside. The temperature dropped instantly. The walls were wet and smooth beneath my fingertips, like they had been shaped by hands rather than erosion. My flashlight flickered violently, its beam shrinking, struggling against the suffocating dark. A sound echoed through the tunnel. Breathing. Not the pale man's. Deeper, wider, older. Then the walls lit up. Not with light, but with faint lines, white grooves etched into the stone, spiraling in patterns exactly like the ones drawn in the dust outside. They pulsed, faintly at first, then brighter, as if reacting to my presence. I stumbled backward, but the passage behind me had shifted, narrower now, closing. The pale man wasn't following me. He hadn't entered at all. He stood at the mouth of the cave, blocking the exit, face unreadable, hands slack at his sides. The cave wanted me alone. The hum built into a low roar. The ground beneath my boots quivered. Pebbles rattled, dust fell. Air rushed through the tunnel as though some massive creature inhaled. I ran deeper. Not by choice, by instinct. The tunnel widened abruptly, revealing a chamber carved smooth by time, or something far more patient than time. At the center was a pool of dark water, still as glass, reflecting my trembling form. Then the water rippled. The hum stopped. Silence pressed against my skull, and a figure rose from the pool. Not the pale man, something else. A shape without edges, a face without features, a body that seemed to form itself from clay dripping silently back into water. It leaned toward me as if smelling me. Then it spoke, without sound. A voice inside my skull, deep, hollow, older than language. You stepped into my breath. You saw my messenger. Now you belong to the stone. I staggered, clutching my head. The pressure of its presence felt like being buried alive under centuries of earth. I tried to speak, tried to move, tried to scream, but the creature only drifted closer, its presence filling the chamber, filling my mind, filling everything. Then, a shout. A human voice. My name, Ken. He had followed me. The chamber shook violently, stone cracking. The creature turned toward the sound, its form losing shape. The hum exploded into a roar. Water sloshed, splashing across the floor. Ken's flashlight burst into view at the mouth of the chamber. Run, he screamed. He didn't need to tell me twice. I bolted toward him as the chamber walls split open like a wound. The creature inside the water pulled itself upward, extending a limb too long to be natural. The pale man appeared behind Ken, stepping silently into the chamber as if the chaos didn't touch him. But he didn't stop us. He turned, blocked the creature's reach with his body, and for a brief moment, he looked at me, not hungry, not curious, not predatory. Sad. He raised his hands, pressed them against the stone, and knocked. 3 times. The chamber collapsed. We ran through a collapsing tunnel as dust exploded around us, choking, blinding. Stone cracked behind us like thunder. Something roared from within the cave, something furious, betrayed, awakened. We burst through the entrance seconds before the entire crevice folded in on itself, sealing the cave permanently beneath tons of red rock. The dust settled. Silence returned. But the pale man was gone, a messenger with no master, a creature carved to guide, trapped between 2 worlds, now buried with the thing that had created it. Ken collapsed beside me, sobbing and shaking. I sank into the sand, chest heaving with terror and exhaustion. Dawn crept over the horizon. I watched it in silence, knowing the desert would never be the same. Not for me. Not for anyone who learned what slept beneath the stone. Some secrets stay buried. Some caves collapse for a reason. Some messengers knock so you never forget the truth buried under your feet. I survived Dead Horse Point, but not because I was brave, not because I was strong. I survived because something carved from darkness and clay chose to stand between me and the thing that wanted to claim me. And sometimes in the stillness of dusk, when the wind stops and the canyon holds its breath, I swear I can still hear it. 3 faint taps from somewhere deep under the earth. A reminder. a warning, a promise that the darkness doesn't forget, and neither will I. The end.